My name is Michael, and I used to work the night shift at a warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a lonely job, but I liked it that way. The warehouse was massive, like a steel labyrinth filled with towering shelves stacked with boxes. Everything about it was repetitive and predictable. Scan a box, move it to its location, and repeat until your shift was over. I found the routine comforting. The warehouse was always cold, no matter the season. The temperature wasn't unbearable, but it was enough to make the air feel heavy. The lights buzzed overhead, casting pale white light that always seemed a bit too dim. The shadows between the shelves seemed alive at times, flickering and shifting as if something moved just out of sight. I told myself it was just the way light played off the stacked boxes. Most of the time, I was alone. There were a few other night shift workers, but the warehouse was so large that we rarely crossed paths. Occasionally, we'd exchange a quick hello in the break room or pass each other in the aisles, but we mostly kept to ourselves. I liked it that way, or at least I thought I did. One night, everything changed. It was a Thursday in late October, and I'd come in for my usual shift. Something felt off as soon as I walked through the doors. The warehouse was darker than usual. The lights were on, but they seemed weaker somehow, like they were struggling to push back the shadows. I shrugged it off and got to work, starting in the electronics section. The repetitive tasks helped me settle into my rhythm. I scanned boxes, stacked them, and moved on. After about an hour, I heard something strange. It was faint at first, like a soft scraping sound, coming from somewhere deep in the aisles. I stopped and listened, but the noise faded away. I figured it was just one of the other workers, and went back to what I was doing. But then I heard it again, louder this time. It wasn't a random noise, it was deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed through the aisles, but there was no response. I stood there for a moment, scanning the dimly lit shelves. Nothing moved. After a while, I shook my head and went back to work. Maybe it was just Tony messing around. He had a weird sense of humor and liked to prank people on slow nights. As the hours went on, the noises didn't stop. They seemed to follow me. I'd hear faint whispers, a creak of metal, or that same dragging sound, but every time I looked, the aisles were empty. Around 2 a.m., I went to the break room for a coffee. The vending machines hummed quietly, and the clock on the wall ticked steadily. The normalcy of it was reassuring. I sat down at the table and sipped my coffee, letting the warmth calm my nerves. Suddenly, the lights in the break room flickered. I froze, staring at the buzzing fluorescent tubes above me. They flickered again, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. My heart started pounding. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to find the door. When I stepped into the hallway, the lights were still on, but they looked dimmer than before. I told myself it was just a power glitch and tried to shake off the unease. But as I walked back to the aisles, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The air smelled different, sharp and metallic, like blood. I tried to ignore it and went back to work, but I couldn't focus. Every sound made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was never anyone. Around 3 a.m., I was in aisle 54, stacking boxes of clothes when the dragging sound came again. This time, it was so loud and close that I dropped the box I was holding. I spun around, my heart racing, but the aisle was empty. "Tony, if this is you, it's not funny," I shouted, my voice shaking. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it down the aisle. The beam of light swept over the shelves and the concrete floor, but there was nothing there. No boxes out of place, no footprints, nothing. I was about to turn back to my work when I noticed something strange. On the floor, at the end of the aisle, was a long, dark smear. It looked like something had been dragged across the concrete, leaving a trail behind. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to leave it alone. But curiosity got the better of me. I followed the trail, my flashlight trembling in my hand. It led around the corner to another aisle, then another, winding deeper into the warehouse. The air grew colder the further I went, and the metallic smell grew stronger. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I rounded the final corner. The trail ended at a stack of boxes. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I noticed the box on top was slightly ajar. My hands shook as I reached for it, pulling the lid back. Inside was a pile of shredded cardboard, and buried beneath it was something that made my blood run cold. A torn piece of fabric, stained dark red. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind raced with questions. What was going on? Was this some kind of sick joke? Before I could think any further, I heard the dragging sound again, this time coming from right behind me. I turned, my flashlight shaking, and the beam caught something moving at the edge of the aisle. It was tall and hunched, its limbs long and twisted. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It stood there for a moment, staring at me, and then it started to move. The way it moved wasn't natural. It dragged itself forward with jerky, unnatural motions, its claws scraping against the concrete floor. My body froze in terror as it closed the distance between us. Finally, my instincts kicked in. I dropped the flashlight and ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until I burst out of the warehouse doors and into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I never went back to that warehouse. I quit the next day and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. I worked the night shift at a warehouse, a massive structure that stretched endlessly into the dark. The job wasn't glamorous, just moving boxes, scanning items, and logging shipments, but it suited me. There was something oddly comforting about the monotony of it. The quiet, the solitude, the predictable rhythm of the work, all of it gave me a sense of control. The warehouse was always cold, even during the summer months. The chills seeped through the steel walls, making the air feel heavy and still. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a harsh, pale glow. Rows of shelves stretched up into shadows, the tops barely visible even in full light. Sometimes I wondered how much of the place I'd never actually seen. It was rare to encounter anyone else during a shift. Occasionally I'd see another worker pushing a cart or stacking boxes, but the building was so vast that those moments were fleeting. Most nights, I felt like the only living thing in the entire place. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't true silence, not really. There was always the faint hum of the lights, the distant whir of machinery, or the occasional creak of metal shelves settling, but those sounds only made the quiet more oppressive, like the building itself was breathing softly around me. One night, as I started my shift, I noticed something felt different. The air was colder than usual, sharp and biting, and the lights seemed dimmer, casting longer shadows than they should have. I shrugged it off and began my routine, scanning items and moving them to their assigned locations. About an hour into the shift, I heard it, a faint scraping sound. It was distant, barely audible, like metal dragging across concrete. I paused, listening. The sound stopped. The building was old, and strange noises weren't uncommon. I chalked it up to the machinery, or maybe one of the other workers moving something heavy. But as I continued down the aisle, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The scraping sound returned, louder this time. It seemed to echo through the aisles, bouncing off the shelves and making it impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. I called out, but my voice sounded small and hollow in the vast space. No answer. I stood still, listening, but the noise stopped again. For a moment, the only sound was the rapid beating of my own heart. Shaking my head, I tried to laugh at myself. It was just the warehouse playing tricks on me. I went back to work, but the unease lingered. Every so often I'd hear faint whispers, like voices just on the edge of hearing. When I turned to look, there was nothing but rows of silent shelves. Later, as I walked to the break room, I noticed something strange. The air had a sharp, metallic smell, faint at first but growing stronger as I moved. It reminded me of rust or blood. The lights in the hallway flickered as I reached the break room. I grabbed a coffee from the vending machine and sat at the table, trying to steady my nerves. The coffee was hot and bitter, but it didn't help. The unsettling feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, then went out entirely. Darkness swallowed the room, so complete that I couldn't see my own hands. My breath caught in my throat, and I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the room's walls and the table in front of me. Everything was still, too still. I got up and moved to the door, stepping cautiously into the hallway. The lights outside were still on, but they were dimmer than before, casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The metallic smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming. I covered my nose with my sleeve and walked quickly back toward the main aisle. As I rounded the corner, I froze. On the floor ahead was a long, dark smear, as if something had been dragged across the concrete. The trail wound between the shelves, disappearing into the shadows. My stomach turned. I wanted to walk away, to ignore it and get back to my work, but my feet carried me forward. The trail led deeper into the warehouse, through aisles I'd rarely ventured into. The air grew colder the further I went, and the lights overhead flickered more frequently. I felt like the walls were closing in, the towering shelves pressing tighter around me. At the end of the trail, I found a pile of broken boxes, their contents spilled across the floor. Among the debris was something that didn't belong, a dark stain that spread across the concrete. My flashlight shook as I aimed it at the mess. The stain wasn't oil or dirt. It was blood. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? Was someone hurt? Before I could react further, the dragging sound returned. This time, it was closer, much closer. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. At first I saw nothing but shadows, but then something moved at the edge of the light. It was tall and thin, its body bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones that jutted out like knives. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and its eyes were nothing but empty, black pits. It stood there, watching me, unmoving. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to move. The thing took a step forward, its long, bony limbs creaking as it moved. Its claws scraped against the concrete floor, the sound echoing through the silent aisles. I finally found my voice and let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward. The creature moved faster now, its jerky motions becoming more fluid as it closed the distance between us. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted through the aisles. The sound of claws scraping the floor followed me, growing louder with each passing second. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The exit was just ahead. I could see the faint glow of the emergency lights near the doors. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs threatening to give out. I burst through the doors and into the cold night air, collapsing onto the pavement. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping for breath. When I finally looked back, the warehouse loomed behind me, silent and still. The doors were closed, and there was no sign of the creature. But I knew it was still in there. I never went back to that place. I quit the next day and tried to move on with my life, but the memories stayed with me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of claws scraping against concrete, and I know it's not just in my head. I worked the night shift at a massive warehouse outside of town. It was the kind of job most people wouldn't want, boring, repetitive, and isolating. But I didn't mind. I preferred being alone, with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythm of my work to keep me company. The warehouse was enormous, a labyrinth of towering shelves, packed with boxes of all shapes and sizes. The aisles stretched endlessly, each numbered in a sequence that seemed logical on paper but felt like wandering through an endless maze in person. Even after months on the job, I hadn't explored every corner. Some parts of the building felt like they were rarely, if ever, touched by human hand. It was always cold, no matter the season. Not freezing, but cold enough that the chill seemed to seep into your bones after a while. The air smelled faintly of dust, cardboard, and the faint tang of oil from the forklifts. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, their glow harsh but dim enough that the tops of the shelves always seemed to be swallowed in shadow. Most nights I barely saw anyone else. The few other night shift workers stuck to their assigned sections, and our paths rarely crossed. Occasionally, we'd bump into each other in the break room, or pass by with a quick nod in the aisles, but for the most part, we worked in silence. I told myself I liked it that way, the quiet, the routine, the lack of distractions. But that all changed one night. It started subtly, little things I could brush off at first, the lights flickering more than usual, strange noises that seemed to come from nowhere, a faint creak of metal, a soft thump, the sound of something scraping against concrete. I told myself it was the building settling, or maybe the forklifts shifting where they were parked. But as the night went on, The noises became harder to ignore. I was working in aisle 47, unloading a shipment of electronics, when I heard it for the first time. A dragging sound, faint and distant, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I stopped, holding my breath, and listened. It stopped. Shaking my head, I went back to work. Probably one of the other workers moving something in another part of the warehouse, I told myself. This place was so big that sounds could echo and travel in strange ways. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. Louder this time, closer. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound was slow and deliberate, as if whatever was making it didn't care about being heard. It came from somewhere deeper in the aisles, beyond the reach of the lights. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky and unsure. The echo of my own voice was the only response. I grabbed my flashlight from my cart and shone it down the aisle. The beam of light swept over shelves stacked with boxes, the concrete floor, and the distant shadows. Nothing moved. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the unease stayed with me. Every creak, every flicker of the lights, every shadow seemed sinister, like the warehouse itself was alive and watching me. The next night, the feeling was worse. I clocked in and immediately noticed something was off. The air felt colder than usual, and there was a strange smell, sharp and metallic, that lingered no matter where I went. I started my shift in the usual section, stacking boxes and scanning items, trying to lose myself in the routine. But the noises started again. Not just the dragging sound this time, but faint whispers, like voices murmuring just out of earshot. I kept telling myself it was nothing, my imagination, the sounds of the building, anything but what it felt like. Then, around midnight, I found the trail. I was moving through aisle 52 when I noticed it. A long, dark smear on the floor, leading from one aisle to another. It looked like something had been dragged across the concrete. My stomach tightened as I stared at the trail. The metallic smell was stronger here, almost overpowering. I hesitated, torn between the instinct to turn around and leave and the irrational pull to follow it. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and began tracing the trail. The smear led through several aisles, winding deeper into the warehouse, into sections I'd rarely visited. The air grew colder the further I went, and the lights flickered more frequently, casting strange, jagged shadows on the walls. Finally, the trail ended in a section near the back of the building. The boxes here were covered in a fine layer of dust, untouched for what seemed like years. In the middle of the floor was a pile of broken boxes, their contents scattered. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, and as the beam of light swept over the pile, I saw it, dark stains spreading across the concrete, pooling beneath the debris. Blood. I stumbled back, my chest tightening with panic. A sound behind me made me spin around, the flashlight whipping through the darkness. At first I saw nothing, but then, at the edge of the light, something moved. It was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long and bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over a gaunt frame. It stood there, hunched and still, watching me with black, empty eyes that seemed to absorb the light. My breath caught in my throat. It moved suddenly, with a jerky, unnatural motion, stepping closer. Its claws scraped against the concrete floor, the sound making my skin crawl. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Then it lunged. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the concrete as I sprinted through the aisles. The sound of its claws scraping the floor echoed behind me, growing louder with each passing second. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The warehouse seemed endless, the aisles stretching on and on. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I kept running, desperate to reach the exit. Finally, I saw it, the faint glow of the emergency lights above the doors. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain in my legs, ignoring the sound of the thing behind me. I burst through the doors and into the night, collapsing onto the pavement. For a long moment, I lay there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally looked back, the warehouse loomed behind me, silent and still. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear it. The faint scrape of claws on concrete,